And now we're going to look at the 2004 presidential election. So in 2004, Bush was pitted against the Democratic candidate John Kerry. John Kerry is currently our U.S. Secretary of State, but of course back then he wasn't. He was a senator and out of Massachusetts, and he was running against Bush. So he ran as the Democratic nominee. One issue was that neither Bush nor Vice President Dick Cheney had served in Vietnam. Kerry was a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War, but he returned a critic of the war, and he was also a critic of the war in Iraq. Bush won the 2004 election, taking 50.7% of the popular vote, first candidate to have had over 50% of the popular vote since his father initially won the 1988 election, and he took 286 electoral votes. During Bush's term, numerous issues that he still had to deal with. We still had the Iraq War. We still had the economy to deal with. These are still major issues. And then Hurricane Katrina wrought destruction upon the Gulf Coast, and the government was widely criticized for being slow to respond. Then we kind of hit the subprime mortgage crisis. And so looking at kind of the prelude to this crisis, for many years, housing prices have been increasing at a rapid rate. Many people began to see their homes as an investment and as a source of income. In fact, some people tapped into home equity lines of credit, pulling out money or borrowing against the equity they had in their homes to finance other things, even sometimes to take vacations. Some experts warned that the so-called bubble would burst. In other words, they felt that the housing prices were too high and that it wasn't sustained and that the bottom would fall out of the market. Well, ultimately, those experts proved to be correct. In late 2007, the bubble did burst and many people defaulted on their loans and went into foreclosure. As a result, when people go into foreclosure, the banks take over ownership of these homes. Then the homes, of course, are usually going to be put back on the market to be sold by the banks to recoup what they've lost. Well, as this happens, there's a major flood of houses dumped on the market, and this ties into the forces of supply and demand. That drives housing prices down. Housing prices began to fall rapidly. And the U.S. also, kind of simultaneous with this, slipped into a recession while the rising prices of oil and inflation worsened the crisis. And many people began to walk away from their homes, and many banks failed. And that's largely due to the fact that, with the housing prices, many people ended up being upside down. They owed more than the home was worth. Many people simply walked away. Banks were left with a house that was worth less than what was owed on the property. They couldn't sell it and get their money back out. There are many different causes to this crisis. Part of it was the boom and bust of the housing market. Speculation also played a role. Many people speculating that housing prices were just going to keep going up. There was also high-risk mortgage loans and lending and borrowing practices. For example, sometimes they were giving out no-doc loans, also referred to as liar's loans, where people didn't have to document the income that they had. So people were encouraged to lie and say that they had more income than they really did. And thus, people qualified for more expensive homes than they really should have. The securitization practices also weren't very good. In fact, how they secured a lot of these loans is they were packaged together as mortgage debt and then basically given a rating based upon the riskiness of the loans, and then they were sold. And then what also began to happen is some of these loans may not have, or some of the, as investments, as securities, they may not have had a AAA rating, but because there weren't enough people out there buying, or investors buying loans that weren't rated AAA, they began to kind of find some sneaky ways to get the AAA rating. That was through what was known as credit default swaps, which was basically buying insurance to insure those loans, and then they could have they buy it from a AAA rated institution, thus they'd have the AAA rating. So a lot of these loans end up being rated higher than they should have been. Plus, many people had inaccurate credit ratings as well, and many government policies that were intended to make home ownership easier also contributed to the crisis. The end result is that a lot of wealth is lost. And so ultimately what ends up happening was several banks start to fail. The government decides to take action. Their biggest concern were the biggest Wall Street banks. And so some of these biggest banks were deemed to be too big to fail. And they received a series of bailouts to keep these banks solvent. Now, ultimately what happens is government money is given to these banks to keep them in business, with the fear that if these banks go under, they're going to be unable to make loans out to other people, and that it's going to hurt the economy even more. In the end, I don't know if that actually would have played out that way. But many Americans became very irritated as these large Wall Street banks got bailed out. And at the end of the day, we also had to deal with the fact that some of the CEOs of some of these companies, or other top executives, maybe not the CEOs, but other high-ranking executives, received large bonuses despite the fact that they were receiving taxpayer money to keep them afloat. That really angered many Americans. And the bailouts actually started under Bush, but they carried into the Obama administration as well. And then the American automobile companies also sought government bailouts because of their sales dropped tremendously during this time period. Part of that was that a lot of the American manufacturers were making cars that weren't so fuel efficient, and gas prices were skyrocketing, which along with the bad economy, people couldn't afford that. So people, instead of looking to buy new cars, or if they were looking to buy new cars, they were looking to buy some foreign cars that were more fuel efficient. So the American automobile manufacturers, many of them began to seek bailouts and began to reorganize and began to really produce some better cars, trying to meet that consumer need. And they have stayed afloat, so the bailouts in a lot of ways could be seen as a success. But once again, both cases, you've got big business being bailed out by the government.